Melissa Prieto is a Toronto-based artist, educator, and community worker from Bogota, Colombia, who believes education and community spaces should nourish people's creative self-expression, affirm their identities, and strengthen their agency. Teaching from anti-oppression frameworks, Melissa creates holistic, body-centered programming to engage people of all ages as active learners and thinkers through multi-generational collaboration, storytelling, and collective care. Melissa is passionate about social justice and community organizing, inspired by the social movements led by Black and Indigenous women, queer communities, and youth in Colombia, and their vision for the respect of life. Her work focuses on activating diverse spaces to include and celebrate the knowledge that children and youth have to offer to social transformation. In 2016, they co-founded Imagine Arte in Toronto, a community arts initiative created to amplify newcomer and immigrant voices through art, play, and exploring our imaginations. Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Hi, Laura. I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good. And I'm really excited to hear a little bit about your practice. I know we have a lot of questions surrounding play and the use of games in community art. So I know you're an expert in this subject, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. I think we can probably jump right into the first question.
Okay.
So I'm very curious to know, in your opinion and in your experience, how do play and education meet?
Okay. I love this question. And I think when we're talking about education, if our focus for education are things like learning, like memory, like problem solving, and even maybe emotional wellness, play can be a great medium to enhance these areas. So, play is so interesting to me because of what it activates in the human brain. So it is believed that play can actually strengthen our neural pathways and our cognitive and emotional functioning. So, because play is so connected to learning, every time we play and we are processing information, our neural pathways actually get thicker and stronger, which makes our brains healthier. So, playing makes our brains and our health healthier and stronger overall. And so, one thing that I found really interesting, I was looking at a couple of studies about like the different kinds of plays that there are, right? There's structured play, there's more unstructured play, which what we know as recess in school, for example, here. And so it was found that like 10 to 30 minutes of just free unstructured play that is completely led by students actually leads to higher academic performance. So in countries where the school system has more frequent breaks for just like unstructured play, even if they're shorter, but they're just more frequent throughout the day, students actually have overall higher academic performance and better well-being than in countries where they don't have this. So I think it's really, really interesting how, in schools here, play becomes like more decreased as students get older, right? Like in high school, there's not a lot of playing going on, especially just like free unstructured play. And I think that that can speak to like the wellness of youth and, a lot of like mental health stuff and mood stuff that is happening when you're in your teenage years. But play could actually be such a helpful thing to reincorporate for children of all ages.
That is really interesting. I love learning about all the magical ways that the brain works. I feel like what you said about it strengthening neural pathways is just like, it's magic. It really
Like,
is.
yeah.
Yeah, it truly blows my mind. And it's interesting too what you say about how play, like almost in our society, we've just come to think of it as something that is used for children and like in, I don't know, kindergarten, younger ages, but it is something that is beneficial for everyone. So
Yeah.
I'm curious to know too, then in your experience, how can we use play to enhance learning in all different types of age groups?
Yeah. So, it's interesting because, okay, let's go with the example like in university, right? When you're, in university, in college, when you're in like postgraduate education, there's so much studying going on. It's very intensive, right? And so I know there is a lot of, for example, study aids that say, okay, for every hour of studying, you can take a small break to reward yourself, and that can look like like watching TV or going for a walk or doing like an activity you enjoy or eating, like whatever that may be. But if we were to actually use those 10 minutes of break for something that is specifically playful, it could actually enhance our ability to focus, like to have more attention. It increases our memory as well. So that is an example of how play could enhance learning.
That's a great technique. I should use that with myself. 'Cause
It's so funny because I definitely didn't use that like in university. And then I think of hindsight, like, that would have been an interesting experiment.
totally. Yeah. In terms of focusing, like sometimes I feel like it's not very natural to be sitting in front of a screen all day, or like to be sitting and doing one task straight without a break, without something to like, I don't know, shake your brain up a little bit. So it's very interesting that you say that. And that really does bring me to my next question, which was what are some of the personal and collective benefits of play?
So there's a lot, right? So, I mean, if we start with the personal, right, we're talking about, okay, the health of our brain, which in turns also means the health of our hormones. Um, and so, what I think is really cool about play is that it's one of the most natural expressions for children, right? Children don't have to be taught how to play. They just naturally do it as soon as, they're old enough to move, basically, right? And so I think that play really is a natural expression for all humans, just overall, right? Because what play really is, it's like freedom of expression, right? And as humans, we have a need for self expression to keep a healthy flow of energy, of ideas, of thoughts, like etc. Which is also why art is so fundamental to our well-being and joy, right? For that self-expression. So when you think of play as unlimited self-expression, we can see how important play is in our lives, right? And so essentially, play is connection. So, in terms of personal benefits, it supports our connection to self, right? Through play, we can learn about ourselves, we can connect with joy, we can connect with our creativity, with our imaginations, our subconscious, our memories, and most of all, we can have fun, right? So when we're having fun, we're feeling joy. Right. And then that releases dopamine and serotonin in our bodies, right? Which are the hormones responsible for uplifted mood, for more energy, and for resilience, even. So, I like to think of play as being really integral for that self expression that feeds our well being. And so that I would say that that is like a personal, one of the many personal benefits. Um, and then taking it kind of to a larger level, play really offers limitless possibilities to exist, right? So, what I think is cool about play is that we kind of fall into this open space where anything and everything is possible, right? And that's why children love play so much because, you use your imagination. You can be anyone that you want to be. You can do anything that you want to be if you're, doing pretend play, which is also why theater is so cool, right? Because if you're doing things like improv, right, you get the imagination in there and then you just create this space that could be like a completely new space or just separate for where you are. And everyone's imaginations are coming together to just create this entirely new world, right? And so through play, we are learning about ourselves, and then we're also learning to navigate and understand social situations, right? We learn to understand information from other people. We learn about our own thoughts and behaviors. And because it is like a safe and open and freeing space, we don't realize that we're learning so much and in such a deep way as well. So, really, play is learning. And so, whenever we're playing, we're learning in one way or another. Another way that I think play is really beneficial in a collective sense is that it strengthens our language development, right? And it's really, really valuable because the amount of learning and growth and healing that can happen can never be replaced by any other structure. So, because play is connection, it is expansive, it is all about possibility. So, when I think of play and why it isn't as common, for example, in everyday school system as it should be, right? Or why it significantly decreases, like we talked about as you get older, right? Is really because play disrupts capitalism. So, capitalism is reliant on restriction and scarcity, but play breaks those molds and connects us with our creativity and intuition, and then with each other's creativity as well. So, I think that, really we are in a point in history where we have to reimagine what futures we are creating. And it actually includes using our imaginations to go beyond the limits that the current social and economic structures have made us believe is possible. So we can definitely use play to tap into, those imaginations to reimagine completely new possibilities on like a personal scale, on a relationship scale, and then like a greater social scale.
That is amazing. That is awesome. Yeah, I love hearing you speak about that. That's really cool. And I love what you say about it disrupting this like capitalist like normalization of this rigidness and like limiting what we can imagine and what we can create. That so yeah, play is awesome.
I love how you keep saying that like it's magical, right? Like there's kind of this magical essence about play because it's very otherworldly, right? Like it's like this expansive existence where we are and we can just do anything, go anywhere. And so
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why I also really admired what you said about it being creativity. Play is the arts, play is creativity, play is education. So, what do you think is like this meeting point for all of those three? Or even if you have some examples of how you've incorporated play in the work that you do and how you've seen it interact with the arts, with creativity, with even just like the sense of surprise in the people who participate in different types of projects.
that's a really good question. I think like so I think I have a naturally like very playful personality. So for me, when I started working with children and then seeing how play was just a natural expression for me it was very natural to bring in play to whatever I was doing that was based on education, for example. So I can think back to when I started working, it was like grade 1 and 2 students, and they were really struggling with their literacy. And they also so I was working like in an after school program, right? And at that time, they really weren't happy with their teachers. The way that the school was run was very like rigid. It was kind of affecting their morale. And so they became really resistant to things like doing their homework, going to school, to like being happy in the classroom, and all of these things. And so I saw that their literacy was really suffering. And we would try to do like literacy activities with them, like reading, kind of more like your more traditional literacy activities, but they were really resistant to that because it was schoolwork, right? So then we started thinking about, okay, how can we maybe approach literacy through play instead? So I came up with this just it was just like a very like quick game that I called secret messages. So what I would do is like they would just take a piece of paper and I would come up with like a secret message, right? So often it was like a funny one or like a really wacky one, or it could be like a interesting question. And on the piece of paper, like I would write the secret messages in lines, right? So there was like the amount of lines per word of the phrase. And then at the bottom of the paper, I would write the alphabet, and each letter would have a number. And so in the message, I would write like the corresponding numbers to the message. And so all they had to do was like they had to match the number to the letter to decipher the message. And what I found was that that game was really good at starting to get them to resist like letter recognition and reading a little bit less because it was really quick, right? It would take them maybe like 7 minutes, 10 minutes to figure out. So they could do a lot of them while they were in the after school program, or sometimes they would take them home and like do them there. And then it was also really fun because like to them, they weren't reading, they weren't doing letter recognition. They were just trying to decipher a secret message that like I came up with, or sometimes their friend would come up with and they had to decipher it. So they would come up with messages for each other. And so I remember that being an activity where, play was brought in, and then it really like strengthened an academic skill, for example.
That's really interesting. And so, do you find that these types of techniques work the same with adults or with different age groups? Or how do they differ?
Yeah, I would say so. Like, for example, last year I was teaching a social justice course for high school students, right? And it was online, which made it even harder to connect. I had never met the students in person, so we were just meeting online. It was during the pandemic, so there was a lot of like social withdrawn, social isolation. They were feeling very like they didn't want to participate. They were very limited in their self expression. And I think that was one of the hardest things about being isolated, and not being able to go to school for kids of all ages. They didn't have that same like self expression that they can have when they're with each other at school, right? So we were learning about, I remember one of the beginning of the classes, like pretty early on in the course, I was thinking like, how can I introduce the terms, the terminology that we're going to be talking about? Some of them are really complex ideas, right? But I know that because they have social media, because there is now like so much social justice conversations going on in social media, I knew that they were mostly going to be like familiar with the topics, if not know a lot about them to begin with. But then to start our conversation together, I really wanted to bring in like a game to do it, right? Not just be like, okay, we're learning about this term and this is what it is, because I knew right then they would kind of just lose interest. So what I did is I just basically took the idea from the game's categories. And so for categories, I just put like all the terms that I wanted to introduce for that day. And then what we did is like, because it was on Zoom, on in like the chat, what I did is I would just like write the word, and then they had 20 seconds to come up with as many associated words, ideas, emotions, phrases that would come to mind when they thought of that word. So it didn't necessarily have to be related to social justice. It could just be anything that they freely associated with that word. And so they really loved that activity because there was no right or wrong answer. It was just like, it just created conversations about, what do we think when we think of this? What do we feel when we think of this? Right. And so that was another really cool activity that, they were high school students and that worked. So I've really seen it like play. I've never seen play fail.
That's awesome. Yeah, because it's like what you said earlier, it just taps into this very natural part of our being where play is just like our second nature. Sometimes maybe we like create a barrier to not let ourselves feel vulnerable, or I don't know what it may be, but ultimately we all have the capacity to play and to enjoy games and to express joy in that way. So that's really interesting. And I also love hearing about how facilitators have adapted to the pandemic and the online reality and the ways that they've found it to work. So it's really interesting. And I also would love to know, how can we incorporate play into our daily lives? So a lot of the folks watching this, they may be art educators, they could be facilitators or community organizers, or simply people who are interested in this type of game activity and incorporating that into education. So how can we incorporate it into our practice, but also into our personal lives?
Yeah, so I think because it's such a natural part of our self-expression, like, as adults, I think play is not really encouraged unless you belong, to a specific like club that you play in, or you're already an artist. in a practice that is more playful, for example. But I think there's a lot of ways, all kinds of ways. Like there's literally unlimited options in how to incorporate play into our lives. If we're thinking about like on a personal level, it could be like getting curious about our environment, right? And it's not necessarily like playing a game, but approaching things in a playful manner. um, I think essentially when we think about it, almost anything can be playful, right? Like I think even about putting an outfit together can be playful, right? Because you're thinking about like, okay, what colors do I want? Like what I want to feel, what I want this to look like. Like you can be really playful with the clothes that you choose. And I think that's something that most people do every single day, right? Like that choosing our clothing and choosing what we want to wear can be regarded as a form of play because there's creativity involved in it. But I think going beyond that, right? Like getting curious about our environment. So, if you work with children, right, you know that they will ask questions. Let's say you're going on a walk with them down the block, they will ask questions about everything that they see, like big questions, small questions, all the things they will ask, right? And so because we're so caught up in like the rush, right? Rushing to work, rushing to school, rushing from point A to point B, we kind of lose that magic of being really curious about our environment. So, it can be things like thinking like, okay, if I want to, experiment with maybe like a little bit more fun or a little bit more playfulness when I'm walking to the bus or I'm walking to the subway, I can pay attention to what's around me, right? I can take a look to see if there's different trees. Like, are there different trees on this street? Do they look different? What is different about them? What is different about their leaves? What is different about their bark? What is different about their height, right? Um, and it really is like a luxury to be able to stop and connect. But I do think that it is a luxury we can give to ourselves, and it's very, very nourishing as well. So that's like one way to be playful. I think another way to be playful, which I've also seen recommended as a mindfulness exercise, is to, when you're like walking down, or even like you can be sitting in your room, you can be sitting at home, and start to count the things that you see, the things that you smell, the things that you hear, like things that you taste, for example, right? So if you say, okay, like five things that are yellow, and then you start to imagine, like, what are five things that are yellow in my home? What are four things that I enjoy the texture of or that like bring me comfort? What are three things that, like make me happy, or kind of things like that, which is like essentially just getting curious about our environment and start to play with it a little bit more and engage with it and find like that dynamic connection. So I think on a personal level we can kind of incorporate more things like that. I think as artists, right, we can make art in a more playful manner, right? So um if we are painting, right, we can give ourselves a chance to kind of drop into just playing a little bit more rather than feeling that pressure to produce. I think I know I have definitely felt it as an artist, this like pressure to just from point A to point B and create that finished product, whether it is for like a show or for like posting on social media or for selling, right? But I think like pausing for a moment and giving ourselves permission to play for a moment and being like, okay, I'm going to finish that painting later, but right now I'm going to play a game with grabbing three things from my room and like color matching those things, right? Seeing if I can mix the paints to color match them, or seeing if I can, let's say like I work with clay, right? So instead of being so focused on like the perfection of the technique, I can give myself permission to just experiment with new textures, or making something that doesn't make sense, or making something that maybe represents my mood in that moment, or represents like a conversation that I had yesterday. And all those things I think can be considered play. And so I think it is especially useful, or it can be especially useful to incorporate play when we think about perfectionism, right? And like we're talking about capitalism, right? Like perfectionism comes from capitalism. So um being more open to the possibilities and leaving that pressure behind to create that finished product is really like gifting yourself a connection with self for that moment. So, this shift really can be regarded as a playful act because you're giving yourself permission to reimagine your relationship with yourself and your relationship with your practice as well. So I think that could be cool for artists. And then if we're talking about educators, right? How we can incorporate more play into our lives is also kind of like gifting ourselves the permission, or like the luxury or the opportunity to connect with ourselves and connect with our own teachings and our own practice. So let's say if we are preparing like a lesson plan to share with students, or we're preparing a workshop that we're going to share with a group of people, actually taking the time to go like give ourselves the workshop, so facilitate ourselves the workshop, right? Which can be really fun if you're incorporating games. So let's say you're doing like a game at some point in your workshop. Before you actually go and facilitate the day of the workshop, give it to yourself, like play that game with yourself, or invite a friend to play that game with you. And then I think that can give you the opportunity to have a new experience of your workshop, right? Because then you become aware, like, oh, I felt like this during that, or I learned this about my own learning style or my own learning process. Or maybe you find that you have to make like a little bit of a change to your workshop based on like your own experience. So that can be a way. And then we can also incorporate more games and more play into our curriculum itself, or our workshops. And I think that we can take like a learning objective that we have, or a topic or a theme that we have, and then thinking, how can we make this a playful activity, right? Like if we're teaching about, I don't know, give me an idea. Let's make a game really quick.
Okay, let's make a game. I love that. We are going to be learning about insects.
Okay, we're gonna be looking at insects. So, what do you want to learn about insects?
We're learning about metamorphosis.
Okay, we're learning about metamorphosis. So we might start by looking like, what are the insects that undergo this metamorphosis, right? And then really we can go anywhere with that, because like, okay, can you pick like an insect that undergoes metamorphosis that you really like?
Let's talk about butterflies.
Okay, so butterflies, right? So I think one of the most beautiful things about butterflies are their colors, right? And so you can take it anywhere. Like if you really wanted to turn this into a game for butterflies, um, obviously, like what comes to mind for me is metamorphosis is very like there's a big component of movement, right? So if you say, okay, maybe I want to bring theater into this, right? So maybe first sharing like a video of what it looks like like how it actually looks like when butterflies go through this metamorphosis, and then guiding students or participants to go through this movement, like a corporal movement themselves, right? And play with it, right? Like, what does it feel to connect with the butterfly and incorporate this movement into our own human bodies? Like, is it uncomfortable? Does it feel weird? Does it feel natural? Maybe it's similar to something you've done before. So, like, that could be a game.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I can see how it's like a way of understanding something that is very scientific, quite complex, but understanding it almost from something that relates to our own feelings, and like with all the senses, you can touch it, you can move with it, you can observe it with color and light. So that's really cool. I like that. That was a really fun exercise. There's so many things we can do.
It's limitless. Like there's no, the limit does not exist.
Absolutely. Well, so thank you so much. This has been such an interesting conversation. I feel super inspired to just have a very playful day. And I also, before we sign off, I wonder if there's any last words that you want to share with our audience.
Well, no, like, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much to Muse Arts for inviting me. It has been so lovely to meet you, Laura. Thank you to Natalia as well for, holding and facilitating this space. Yeah, I just encourage everyone to play in whatever form that may look like. And, it's essentially better for our health. It's essentially better for our social and our economic structures. So I think those are my last words.
Thank you so much. We've loved having you here. And for people who are watching at home, we do have comments open. So if you have any questions for Melissa, feel free to leave them below. Thank you. And we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you. Ciao.
Ciao.